Some men spend their whole lives building things, houses, families, futures, and some men spend their whole lives tearing those things down while smiling at you across the dinner table. I'm George Bateman, 73 years old, retired contractor. I live in Lake Forest, Illinois, born and raised. And for 16 years I watched a man named Tony Cole treat me like something he'd scraped off the bottom of his shoe, while I quietly funded the very life his daughter was living. I never said a word. Not once. Until the day my son sent me a text message that changed everything. It was a Thursday evening in late May, the kind of evening Lake Forest does better than anywhere else. Warm breeze off Lake Michigan. The smell of fresh-cut grass drifting through the neighborhood. Fireflies just starting to blink around the oak trees on my street. I was in my garage on Birchwood Lane, sanding down a small bookshelf I'd been building for Nathan's room when my phone buzzed on the workbench. I figured it was my son confirming pickup times for the graduation dinner tomorrow night. I wiped my hands on my jeans and picked it up. It wasn't a confirmation, it was a dismissal. "Dad, please skip the graduation dinner. Annie thinks it's best if we keep it to her side of the family. We don't want any awkwardness. I hope you understand." I read it once, then I read it again. Then a third time just to make sure I wasn't misreading plain English. My own son, my only son, telling me to stay home while my grandson walked across that stage. I set the phone face down on the workbench, picked up the sandpaper, and kept sanding. Not because it didn't hurt. Lord, it hurt. It hurt the way only a betrayal wrapped in polite language can hurt. Soft on the outside, serrated on the inside. But I'd had 16 years of practice swallowing pain. I wasn't about to fall apart over a text message. Not yet. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Get comfortable. This story is going to take you somewhere. Hit that like button and drop a comment below, letting me know where you're watching from. Trust me, you're going to love it here. Let me take you back to where this really started, because you need to understand the full picture before you judge anyone, including me. 16 years ago, Ryan was 24 and finishing his junior year at Northwestern when he called me with news that rearranged both our lives. "Dad, Annie's pregnant. We're keeping it, and I want to marry her." I told him I was proud of him for stepping up. I meant it. What I didn't know then was that across town in a Winnetka house with a 3-car garage and a lawn service, Tony Cole was sitting at his kitchen table absorbing the same news and arriving at a completely different reaction. Ryan told me later that Tony's first words were, "She threw her whole future away." Not congratulations. Not "we'll figure this out." Just a quiet, devastating verdict delivered like a judge sentencing someone to life. From that day forward, Tony treated Ryan like a man perpetually on probation. Every family dinner at their place over in Winnetka felt like a performance review Ryan could never pass. Tony would sit at the head of his big mahogany table, which I later found out was financed. But we'll get to that. And he'd hold court like he was chairman of the board. Ryan, Annie's old roommate, just made partner at her firm. 34 years old. Can you imagine? Or my personal favorite, a contractor's son, huh? Well, at least you've got a trade to fall back on. That last one was directed at me, not Ryan. Said with a smile. Of course, always with a smile. Janice was softer about it. She'd just tilt her head and say things like, "We just want Annie to have everything she deserves," as if Ryan, and by extension me, were somehow standing between Annie and everything she deserved. I used to drive home from those dinners in my old Toyota Tacoma, windows down, Lakeshore Drive humming under the tires, and I'd talk to my late wife Edith in the empty passenger seat. Edith, I swear that man irons his arrogance along with his shirts. I could almost hear her laugh. But here's the thing. Nobody understood about why I kept showing up to those dinners and swallowing every insult Tony threw my way. It wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Ryan had already lost enough dignity in that marriage. Not because of Annie, who I believe genuinely loved him, but because of what her parents made him feel every single day. The last thing I was going to do was force my son to stand in the middle between his father and his in-laws and choose sides. That would have broken him. I stayed quiet. I smiled. I passed the breadbasket, and I kept building. 3 years ago, Ryan and Annie bought a house on Hawthorne Road, a beautiful colonial in a good Lake Forest neighborhood. Good school district, the kind of place you raise a family with pride. They stretched every dollar they had to get into it. When the house started showing its age, foundation issues, an outdated kitchen, a leaking roof, plumbing that sounded like it was arguing with itself, Ryan mentioned it casually one Sunday afternoon when he stopped by my garage. It's just one thing after another. Dad, I don't know how we're going to manage all of it. He wasn't asking me for money. Ryan never asked me for money directly. That was the kind of man he was. Too proud to ask, too stressed to hide it. I didn't make a speech about it. I just called my attorney Monday morning and started moving funds. $93,000 over 14 months. Kitchen redesign. New roof. Foundation reinforcement. Updated plumbing. Nathan's study room built exactly the way Nathan described it to me one Saturday over deep dish at Pequod's on the north side. And Annie's walk-in pantry because I'd heard her mention it twice. And I wanted her to feel at home in that house. I supervised every contractor personally. Drove to the site on Hawthorne Road 3-4 times a week. Pulled favors from guys I'd worked with for 30 years to make sure the work was done right. And here's the part I never told Ryan. The real reason I did it. Because I'd watched my son lose pieces of himself every time he had to sit across from Tony Cole and feel insufficient. And I wasn't about to let him lose what little dignity he had left by going to that man with his hand out. As long as I had money and 2 working hands, my son was never going to owe Tony Cole favor. That was my line in the sand. The final payment, $14,000, was scheduled for release that Friday. One day after Nathan's graduation dinner, the dinner I'd just been uninvited from, I stood in my garage on Birchwood Lane for a long time that night, hand resting on the half-finished bookshelf, phone sitting face down on the workbench, 73 years old. Watched my wife get buried, built things with my bare hands my whole life, and my son can't save me a seat at a dinner table. I picked up the phone, opened Ryan's message, and typed back 7 letters. I understand. Take care. I hit send. Then I called my attorney, a sharp Lake Forest man named Bill Garrett, who'd been handling my affairs for 20 years. Bill, that final renovation payment. Freeze it first thing tomorrow. Brief pause on the line. Everything all right? George? Not particularly, but it will be. I hung up, walked back to the shelf, picked up the sandpaper, and for the first time in 16 years, I stopped building things for people who didn't even want me at their table. By noon the next day, the day of Nathan's graduation dinner, the contractor's crew had downed tools, loaded their equipment, and walked off the Hawthorne Road property. The kitchen sat half-finished, exposed drywall, uninstalled cabinetry stacked against the wall, a walk-in pantry framed but unfinished, 4 walls and no shelving. The phone call that told me everything I needed to know about my daughter-in-law came at 7:14 the next morning, and she didn't even say hello. George, what did you do? Annie's voice, sharp, already accusing me before I'd had my first sip of coffee. Good morning to you, too, Annie, I said, leaning against my kitchen counter. I'm guessing the crew didn't show up today. They said the payment stopped. They said you froze everything. Her voice cracked somewhere between fury and panic. George, we have 30 people coming in 11 days. My father's business partners. The Kowalskis from the club. I know who's coming. Annie, I said slow and deliberate. I helped plan half of it. Remember? Then fix it. I think you misunderstood my situation, I said, keeping my voice level, almost gentle. I was told I'm not welcome at this celebration, so I figured my checkbook wasn't welcome either. Silence on the other end. The kind where you can practically hear someone recalculating their entire strategy. I hung up before she could answer. That's the first time in 16 years I've hung up on a call. I felt better than I expected. If you think stopping the payment was the most devastating thing I did, stay with me. Because what came next didn't just rock their world. It dismantled the entire foundation they were standing on. There's a specific kind of silence that follows a decision you can't take back. Not peaceful, not empty, just final. Like the last nail driven into a coffin lid. That's what my house on Birchwood Lane felt like the morning after Nathan's graduation dinner. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table Edith and I had shared for 31 years. I watched the sun come up over the backyard oak tree, and I waited, because I knew Ryan would come. I just didn't know how long his pride would hold before panic overrode it. It took 48 hours. It was a Saturday morning when I heard the knock. Not the doorbell. The knock. Hard. Urgent. The knock of a man who'd rehearsed what he was going to say the entire drive over. I opened the door. Ryan stood on my porch in a Northwestern sweatshirt and jeans, jaw tight, eyes red around the edges. Behind him, his Jeep was still running in the driveway. He hadn't even turned off the engine. He planned to make this quick. Dad. He exhaled the word like it cost him something. What is going on? I've got workers calling me saying the job is shut down. The kitchen looks like a demolition site. What are you doing? I stepped aside. Come in. Ryan. I don't need to come in. I need to know what... Ryan. I said it quieter that time. Come inside. He came inside. I poured him a coffee without asking. Set it in front of him at the kitchen table. Sat down across from him. Both hands wrapped around my own mug, and looked at my son. Really looked at him for the first time in a while. He looked tired. Not just today tired. Years tired. You sent me a text, I said, Thursday night. He shifted in his seat. Dad, that was Annie was stressed about the dinner and Tony was... You sent me a text. I repeated, calm, even. Telling me I wasn't welcome at my grandson's graduation dinner. Yes or no? Silence. Yes, he said finally, quietly. Okay, I nodded. Then you understand why I made the call I made. No, Dad, I really don't. Because that's $14,000 sitting between us and a finished house. And you're making a point. I'm not making a point. Ryan, I leaned forward slightly. I'm drawing a boundary. There's a difference. A point is something you make in an argument. A boundary is something you enforce when you finally respect yourself enough to do it. He stared at me. Good. Let it land. I spent $93,000 on that house. I said, not because you asked me to, because I watched you shrink every single time you sat across from Tony Cole feeling like you weren't enough. And I decided as long as I had money, my son was never going to have to go to that man with his hand out. I paused. That was the deal I made with myself. Not with you. With myself. Ryan's jaw worked. Dad, but if I'm not family enough to sit at the dinner table, I said, then I'm no longer responsible for financing the life you're building. That's not revenge, son. That's just logic. He left 20 minutes later. Engine still warm. I watched his Jeep back out of the driveway and felt something I hadn't felt in 16 years, like myself. Now, here's where the story shifts, and you need to pay attention because this is the part where the illusion starts cracking. Ryan went home and told Annie everything, and Annie did exactly what I expected her to do. She picked up the phone and called her mother. Ryan told me later, almost word for word, how that conversation went. Annie pacing the unfinished kitchen, stepping over paint tarps, phone pressed to her ear. Mom, George froze the renovation money, all of it. We need Dad to cover the final payment or this whole thing stalls out indefinitely. Janice's response, delivered in that practiced, serene tone she used whenever she wanted to sound like everything was under control, was, "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll talk to your father." 3 words that have bankrupted more people than any market crash in history. Don't worry, sweetheart. Tony called Ryan himself the next morning. And I wish I could have seen Tony's face when he made that call, because Tony Cole was a man who lived for moments like this. Moments where he got to swoop in and demonstrate his superiority over the contractor's son and the contractor's father. Ryan, don't stress. I'll make some calls. This is nothing. Big voice. Absolute confidence the financial cavalry had arrived. Ryan actually felt relieved. That relief lasted less than 48 hours. Tony promised the cash by Monday morning. Monday afternoon came and went. Nothing but a text about a temporary banking glitch. By Tuesday, Tony's phone was going straight to voicemail. On Wednesday morning, unable to look at his half-destroyed kitchen any longer, Ryan drove straight to Winnetka to meet him. He told me later he sat across from Tony in that big formal living room, the one with the leather furniture and the framed golf photos, and the crystal decanter on the sideboard that was always full and never actually opened, and asked him directly, "Do you have the money or not?" And Tony Cole, the man who'd spent 16 years making my son feel small, looked across that mahogany coffee table and said, "It's complicated right now, Ryan. Complicated." Ryan started pulling threads, and in a town like Lake Forest, once you pull one loose string, the whole suit falls apart, because I'd threatened legal action on their house. Ryan had to look into their options, which led him to search the public county registry for Tony's properties. What he found shook him to his core. The Winnetka house, the crown jewel, had been refinanced twice in 4 years. The equity was completely drained. The bank practically owned it. Once Ryan's eyes were opened, the small details began to paint a horrific picture. He remembered a call he'd received a month ago from a collections agency looking for Tony. He had ignored it then, thinking it was a mistake. Now he knew better. He called a buddy of his who worked the pro shop at the country club. His buddy grew quiet on the phone before admitting it. Tony's membership had been quietly suspended for non-payment 8 months ago. The luxury SUV, leased under a corporate account that was currently facing a repossession order. Tony Cole wasn't wealthy. Tony Cole was a performance, and the curtain had just come down. Ryan called me that night. It was almost 10 o'clock. "Dad," his voice was different, hollow, like a man who just walked through a door he couldn't walk back through. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Tell you what? That they were, that he was all of it. Why didn't you say something?" I was quiet for a moment, because it wasn't mine to say. I told him, "A man," clears throat, "doesn't tear down his son's marriage to prove a point, even when the point needs proving." He didn't respond right away. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. 16 years. "Dad, I know. He made me feel like every single dinner, every holiday, every time I tried to—" He stopped, started again. "And the whole time he was—" "Yeah," I said softly. "The whole time." Long pause. What do I do now? And that right there, that question, was the most grown my son had sounded in 16 years. "Nothing tonight," I said. "Get some sleep. We'll figure out the rest." Meanwhile, I'd had my own conversation with Bill Garrett. Bill is the kind of attorney who doesn't waste words, straight-line thinker. 20 years handling my affairs. He knows exactly how I operate. "George, when you helped them buy that place, you didn't just co-sign the loan. You put your name on the deed to secure the financing," Bill said, looking over the paperwork. "That means you carry massive liability, but it also means you have undivided legal interest in the property. If things deteriorate, you have the standing to petition the court for a partition sale to protect your equity." I sat with that for a moment. I didn't want to force a sale of the house. That was never the goal. Nathan lived in that house, but I also wasn't going to remain legally tied to a piece of property where I've been told I'm not welcome at the dinner table. "Draft the partition action paperwork," I said. "Don't file it yet. Just send a copy of the preliminary notice to Ryan and Annie, so they know I'm serious about pulling my equity out." "Understood." Bill said, "George, are you sure about all of this?" "Bill, I've sure about very few things in my life. I leaned back in my chair. This is one of them. When Ryan received the preliminary notice that the property could be moved toward listing, that his father, the quiet retired contractor from Birchwood Lane, had legal standing to initiate a sale, the panic that followed was something I'm told was biblical in scale. Annie called Ryan at work. Ryan called Bill Garrett's office and was politely informed that Mr. Garrett represented George Bateman and could not discuss the matter with him. Annie called her mother, who called Tony, who apparently put his fist through a wall in that big formal living room, right next to the golf photos. I heard about that secondhand. I won't pretend I didn't smile. Neighbors on Hawthorne Road were already talking. An abandoned renovation is not subtle. Exposed drywall visible through the front windows, equipment gone. Contractors who'd been there every day vanished. People notice. People talk. Lake Forest is a big town with a small town memory. The image Tony had spent 16 years carefully constructing. The successful father-in-law, the patriarch, the man of means, was dissolving in public, one unanswered question at a time. That's when Nathan showed up at my door. Not Ryan, not Annie. Nathan, 16 years old, drove himself over in the used Honda Civic I'd helped him practice parallel parking in last winter. Stood on my porch on a Tuesday afternoon in his Lake Forest high lacrosse hoodie, with his grandfather's eyes and his father's jawline. "Grandpa." He looked at me steady. "I talked to one of the contractors, Mr. Kowalski. He told me you paid almost every invoice on the whole project." I stepped aside. "Come in." "Nathan." He came in. Didn't need a second invitation. I set a Coke in front of him, sat down across from him at Edith's table, and I opened a folder I'd kept in the kitchen drawer since the day I froze the payment. Receipts, wire transfers, material invoices, contractor agreements, payment schedules. $93,420 itemized. Nathan looked through every page, slowly, carefully, the way his grandfather had taught him to read a blueprint. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. He didn't let them spill. "That's my grandson. They told me you abandoned us," he said. "I know. That's not what this says." He tapped the folder. "No," I agreed. "It's not." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "So, why'd you stop?" he asked. I looked at my grandson, this boy I'd taught to fish off the Walk Again pier, and I told him the truth. "Because there's a difference between loving your family," I said, "and allowing your family to treat you like you're invisible." Nathan nodded slowly. Then he picked up his Coke, leaned back in his chair, and said, quiet, matter of fact, 16 years old. "Grandpa, I never thought you were invisible." And just like that, 73 years old, retired contractor widower. I had to work very hard to keep my own eyes dry. If you've been listening for a while, drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button while you're at it. And be sure you're subscribed. The house wasn't sold, the renovation wasn't restarted, and the money didn't go where anyone expected. But the most devastating move I made wasn't financial. It wasn't legal. It was something far more permanent. There's a moment in every man's life when he stops reacting and starts deciding. Not out of anger, not out of spite, out of something quieter and, more dangerous. Clarity. I reached that moment on a Wednesday morning in early June, sitting at Edith's kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and a legal pad in front of me covered in numbers. $93,000. 16 years, one text message. I picked up my pen and started writing. Bill Garrett arrived at my house on Birchwood Lane at 9 o'clock sharp that Wednesday. He drove a sensible gray Buick, wore the same style of charcoal suit he'd worn for 20 years, and carried a leather briefcase that had seen more family catastrophes than a therapist's couch. He sat across from me, spread his documents out, and looked at me over his reading glasses. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to make sure you've thought this through completely, George, because what you're describing is permanent." "Bill," I said, "I've been thinking this through for 16 years. I'm just now writing it down." He almost smiled. Almost. "All right, then, let's build something." Here's what most people don't understand about quiet men. They assume quiet means passive. They assume because a man doesn't shout, he isn't thinking. They assume because he smiles and passes the breadbasket and absorbs the insults without flinching, he has no moves left. Tony Cole made that assumption for 16 years. It was the most expensive mistake of his life. While Ryan and Annie were scrambling to find $14,000 for a contractor, while Tony was making phone calls that went nowhere and offering explanations that convinced nobody, while Annie was stress calling her mother twice a day about the unfinished kitchen and the listing notice, and the neighbors who kept slowing their cars down in front of the house on Hawthorne Road, I was sitting with Bill Garrett restructuring every single financial decision I had ever made on behalf of my son's family. First order of business, getting my name off that property. Bill sent the preliminary partition notice, and it did exactly what it was meant to do. Ryan, backed into a corner with no parental help coming from the Cole side, was forced to go to a local lender and refinance the entire property completely in his and Annie's names to buy out my legal interest. It cost him. He had to absorb a brutal interest rate in today's market, which skyrocketed his monthly payment, but it severed my legal and financial liability completely. The day the refinance went through, my name was officially removed from the deed and the mortgage. I walked out of the bank on a Thursday afternoon, took a deep breath of that crisp lake forest air, and felt the weight of a decade and a half lift off my shoulders like scaffolding coming down after a job is done. Second order of business. And this is the one that mattered most. The $93,000 I had already spent on that house, gone. That was a gift freely given, and I had no interest in clawing it back from my son. But the $14,000 still sitting in my account, the final payment that was never released, that money had a new destination. Nathan Bateman turned 17 in August. 3 weeks before his birthday, he received a certified letter at the house on Hawthorne Road, addressed specifically to him, not to Ryan, not to Annie, to Nathan. Inside was a document from Bill Garrett's office finalizing a legally protected college tuition trust in Nathan's name. That $14,000, the exact amount Tony had publicly bragged he was donating toward Nathan's upcoming freshman housing and enrollment fees before his accounts froze, completely covered the binder. George didn't just save the renovation money. He used Tony's exact financial shortfall to secure his grandson's immediate future. Alongside it was a handwritten note from me. 1 page. Blue ink. My handwriting that Nathan always said looked like a contractor's blueprint. It read, "Nathan, a house can be rebuilt. Character cannot. I hope this helps you build both. Every dollar in this account was earned honestly, saved carefully, and is yours completely. No conditions, no strings, no one else's name on it. Use it to become whoever Grandma and I always knew you'd be. All my love, Grandpa George." Ryan called me 20 minutes after Nathan showed him the letter. "Dad," his voice cracked on the first syllable. Just that one word, and I could hear 16 years of things neither of us had said sitting right behind it. "You didn't have to do that. I know. That was the money for the... I know what it was for." "Ryan." Silence. "Why?" he asked. Simple. Raw. No performance in it. Because your son deserves to start his life without owing anybody anything. I said, "That's a feeling I wanted him to have. Didn't get to give it to you early enough. I'm giving it to him now." Ryan didn't respond right away. I heard him exhale, long and slow, like a man releasing something he'd been holding in his chest for years. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said finally. "For the text, for the dinner, for all of it, for letting it go on as long as it did." I let those words sit in the air for a moment. Let them mean what they meant. Come over Sunday, I said. I'll make Chicago-style Italian beef. We'll sit in the garage like we used to. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, I'd like that. Now, I know what you're waiting for. You want to know what happened to Tony Cole. So do I. Pull up a chair. The listing notice Bill prepared had done its job before I ever had to file it publicly. Word travels fast in Lake Forest. Fast and far. A cosigner threatening to list a property in a neighborhood like Hawthorne Road is not a whisper. It's a fire alarm. Tony's name was attached to that family. By extension. The story of the abandoned renovation, the frozen payment, and the financial scramble became quiet neighborhood knowledge within 2 weeks. The kind of knowledge that spreads at the farmer's market on Western Avenue, at the coffee counter inside Sunset Foods, at the Saturday morning tables outside the Egg Harbor Cafe on Deer Path Road. People started asking questions Tony couldn't answer. But the real unraveling didn't happen in Lake Forest. It happened right inside Tony's own dining room. Ryan brought the public records and the evidence of the country club suspension home one evening. He didn't shout. He just laid the printed public foreclosure warnings and notices out on the kitchen table at Hawthorne Road. Annie sat across from him and read every single page in absolute silence. She looked at the debt totals, the late notices, the realities of the fraud her father had been running just to keep up appearances. She didn't cry immediately. She just went very, very still, the color completely draining from her face. "He told me we came from money," she said finally. Her voice was barely a whisper, hollow and broken. "He told me that my whole life." Ryan reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I know," he said softly. "He looked down on your father," she said. Her voice shifted on that last word, tightened. "He looked down on George. For what? For being honest about what he had?" Ryan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Annie called me herself 3 days later. I'll be honest, I didn't expect that. For 16 years, Annie and I had maintained a cold, transactional distance. She had inherited her father's knack for treating people like staff. But the total collapse of Tony's illusion had clearly shattered her world, forcing her to see the truth of who actually protected her family. This call was completely different. No armor, no pretense. "George!" Her voice was steady, but I could hear the effort behind it. "I owe you an apology. A real one, not a polite one. Annie, please let me finish." She took a breath. "I pushed Ryan to ask my parents for help when you froze the payment. I thought I believed they could fix it because I'd spent my whole life believing they could fix anything." Pause. "I didn't know about the debt, about any of it. But that's not entirely an excuse because I knew what my father was doing to you and Ryan at those dinners. And I let it happen." Another breath. "I let it happen for a long time, and I'm sorry." I was quiet for a moment. My wife Edith always said the most powerful thing a person can do is apologize without an escape route. "I appreciate that. Annie," I said, "I mean it. And for what it's worth. I never blamed you. Not once. You should have," she said softly. "Maybe," I said. "But I didn't. Tony Cole called me exactly once. One time in 16 years did that man dial my number directly and speak to me without an audience present. It was a Tuesday evening in late June. I was in my garage. The bookshelf I'd been building for Nathan the night the text arrived was finished, sanded, stained, and sitting by the door, waiting to be delivered. My phone buzzed. Unknown number, but I knew the area code. "Winnetka." I picked up. "George." Tony's voice was different on the phone, without a dinner table between us and an audience watching. Smaller, somehow. Like a building that looks impressive from the street and hollow from the inside. "I think we should talk. Man to man, man to man. 16 years in, and suddenly, we're men. We're talking now. Tony," I said. Silence. He hadn't expected that to be so easy. "Look, things got complicated with the money. I want you to know that wasn't intentional. The situation with Ryan and the house, Tony." I set down the sandpaper. "I'm going to stop you there. He stopped. I don't need an explanation. I said, I'm not angry at you. I want you to understand that clearly. I'm not angry. I'm just done. Done pretending I don't see what I see. Done funding a narrative where you're the patriarch and I'm the help. Done co-signing a life where my presence is tolerated when it's financially useful and removed when it's socially inconvenient. I paused. I'm retired. Tony. From contracting. From nonsense. From both. Long silence on the line. When he spoke again, the big voice was gone. What replaced it was something I hadn't heard from Tony Cole before. A quiet man, I suppose, he said slowly. I you more than I ever paid. You don't owe me a thing, I said, and I meant it. Just leave my son alone. Let him stand up straight for once. That's all I ever wanted. He hung up. I set the phone down, picked up the sandpaper, finished the bookshelf. The celebration for Nathan's 17th birthday happened on a warm Saturday afternoon in late August at my house on Birchwood Lane. It was the first real family gathering we'd had since the storm settled. No catered service, no country club lawn, no designer centerpieces or name cards, and certainly no Tony Cole holding court at the head of a table. Just my backyard, string lights in the oak tree, a cooler full of drinks, Italian beef sandwiches from Al's Beef, and a massive Chicago-style chocolate birthday cake from the bakery on Deer Path, the same one Edith and I had ordered his cakes from since he was 6 years old. Ryan arrived early and helped me set up the folding tables. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. There's a kind of silence between a father and son that has been repaired. Not perfect, not without scar tissue, but repaired. And it feels entirely different from the silence of avoidance. It feels like relief. Annie brought flowers from the garden center on Illinois Road and arranged them in mason jars along the tables without being asked. She caught my eye at one point and gave me a small nod. I nodded back. Nathan arrived with 2 friends from the lacrosse team. Good kids, loud in the way 17-year-olds are supposed to be loud. And when he walked through the back gate and saw the setup, he stopped, looked around the yard, the lights, the tables, his parents standing together without the performance of impressing anyone. His grandfather by the grill in an old flannel shirt with a pair of tongs and absolutely no apologies for any of it. He walked straight over to me and hugged me the way you hug someone when you've been worried about losing them. Thanks for not giving up on us, Grandpa. He said into my shoulder. 73 years old. I held on a little longer than I probably should have. Wasn't an option. I told him, now go eat. You're making me look sentimental in front of company. He laughed big and genuine and free and went to join his friends. The illusion didn't just crack, it shattered. While we were celebrating in the backyard, Tony and Janice were in an empty Winnetka house staring at a foreclosure notice. The luxury SUV was already sitting back on the dealership lot. Returned on a quiet weekday morning with nobody watching. I didn't have to lift a finger to destroy Tony Cole. A lifetime of lies and borrowed money did that for him. I just stopped holding up the mirror. There's something they don't tell you about revenge. The real kind. The kind that actually sticks. It doesn't feel like fire. It feels like a warm August evening in your own backyard. String lights in the oak tree. Your grandson laughing with his friends. Your son sitting in a lawn chair with a cold drink looking more relaxed than you've seen him in years. It feels like finally understanding the difference between what you built and what you funded. Tony Cole funded an illusion. I built a family, and on that Saturday evening on Birchwood Lane, watching Nathan blow out the candles on his 17th birthday cake while his friends cheered. Ryan walked over to the workbench in the garage where my phone had sat face down 3 months ago. He looked at the wood grain, then looked at me. I pulled up my sent messages from graduation week. Dad, Ryan said, his voice thick with regret. I don't even recognize the man who sent you that text. I am so sorry for everything. He reached out, and for the first time in 16 years, my son hugged me like he finally knew who his real father was. In that moment, watching the birthday candles get blown out and the string lights twinkle in the old oak tree. I finally understood something Edith had been trying to tell me for years. The greatest inheritance a man can leave isn't money. It isn't property. It isn't even a name. It's the truth about who he was when nobody was watching, when it cost him something, when it would have been easier to stay silent and keep writing checks and pretend that being used was the same thing as being loved. I'm George Bateman, 73 years old, retired contractor, and I built something Tony Cole never could. I built something that actually lasts. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. I will see you on the next one.